Great Expectations 1.0 is here, and in today's video, we'll explore how to get started with it. This video builds on a previous introduction to data testing in GX, so for the full experience, be sure to watch that one too. In the last video, we set up a basic structure for using Great Expectations. Using that script, we'll take a step-by-step approach to unpack GX, exploring its components and how they integrate together to form a reliable data testing framework. And while we're at it, we'll also refactor the script to make it more maintainable and scalable, so that by the end of the video, you'll have a better understanding of how to set up Great Expectations effectively. This is where we left things last time, where we have one script called GX Setup, which takes care of the setup part of the workflow, and then we have a second script called GX Run, which we can use to run our workflow. And to support the setting up and the testing of the run, we have two data sets. The first one is from November 21, which we use in our GX setup script to set up the workflow, to write our expectations, to test if our expectations work, and if we can call checkpoint object. We'll get to all of that in a bit. And then the second data set, which is from January 22, and that's the one that we use for our GX run script, just to validate if, after setting up our entire workflow, it all comes together and properly works when we call GX run. So let's move back to the GX setup script and then run the code in there in its entirety. So we're back to the point where we left things off last time. And while I do, I'll zoom in a bit because this is all quite little. So if we look to the interactive terminal, we can see that the expectations were ran twice, once just after creating the expectation suite, and the second time when the checkpoint object is invoked. We'll get to that in a bit, but let's first focus on that context object that's generated here. And as you can see, I'm passing the mode file to that method. And then what happens when you run this method is that a GX directory is created. And within it, you'll find the Great Expectations YAML file. And this YAML file contains the configurations for your Great Expectations project, but primarily with regards to artifacts. So one of the first things that we see here is stores. And under it, we can see a store for each of the artifacts that we create. And here you can see that for the class names, they're referencing to a file system backend with a directory. And this maps onto what you see on the left here in my file explorer, where each of the stores, let's say the expectation store, has a directory counterpart on my local machine. So this is what Great Expectations uses to figure out where the artifacts should go when they are generated. So apart from the locations where the artifacts should go, they also have names here, and then the next section is the Datadog site, and this is the location where the website that Great Expectations can generate for you should go. And in this case, we're also seeing that it's using a file system store backend, so it's saving that generated website locally on my machine. Then going on, there's also some configuration here on the Fluent data sources, and this is where we see the data source that we initialized in the setup script, namely in this bit, where we say that we want to create a data source, a data asset, and a batch definition, and that's automatically translated into this configuration file that we see here. So the TLDR version of this explanation is basically that the Great Expectations YAML file helps you configure the Great Expectations backend. So moving back to the setup script, now we've handled the context bit, onto the other objects that we see of Great Expectations. So the first ones are the data source, the data asset, and the batch definition. And these are really used to define what data source am I using, which asset can I define within that data source, and then how do I get a batch from that data source. And this is really where GX has implemented functions and methods to help you load data and batch data up, but I prefer to do that myself. So whenever I use GX, I always use in-memory data frames, and I just pass that at runtime. So in the last video, in this video, and also in future videos, what you'll see is that I'll always be using the pandas in-memory data source, use a data frame asset, and my batch definition will always be the whole data frame. Moving on from the data sources, the next object that we run into is the expectation suite. And basically the expectation suite is just a bundle of expectations, and expectations are the word that Great Expectations use for tests. So basically I just define a set of tests or expectations, I bundle those up, and then I get an expectation suite. The nice thing about Great Expectations is that you get quite a lot of these tests built into the package from the get-go. And what you can do is you can go to their website, browse the expectations gallery to check out what they have and to also see for which data sources they are available, because the pandas data source is just one of many. You also have Spark and other specific data sources. So really check out the website. Then scrolling down a bit further in the script, because what follows is the definition of expectations, we get to the point where there we go. First create a batch definition, and as I was saying before, the way I use GX, I always leverage entire data frames. So the only thing that happens here is I pass the in-memory pandas data frame to GX and it creates a batch definition, which is just the entire data set. It's a bit convoluted, but bear with me. And then what I can do here is I can call that expectation suite over that batch to see what the results are. Now this is just for the setting up the workflow bit, but if I really want to use this in a more production-like setup, then what I want to do is create a validation definition and a checkpoint. So what do these objects do? The first one, validation definition, it simply bundles up the batch definition that I have with the expectation suite that I just defined, so that these two can go hand in hand. I load data from this specific setup, and then I call that expectation suite over it to get results. So those two are bundled, but then in the next step, we get to the checkpoint where we take that validation definition or more, because you can use a checkpoint to run one or multiple validation definitions. But then you also connect actions to that. So in this case, what you see here is that I have an action list which only contains the update data docs. So when I run a validation definition, what it then does after completing that is update the data docs website. There are more actions available, but for now I'm just going to stick to that one. And then what you see here in this last snippet is that I create a checkpoint where I take that one validation definition, and for my purposes I just want to use one. I combine that with that list of actions, which in my case is just updating the data docs. And then I also specify here that I want the result format to be complete. And by setting this result format to complete, what I get are complete JSON artifacts from running the validations, which can be useful if you want to build stuff on top of the artifacts from Great Expectations. So, going back to the script, one of the first things that is a bit of an issue is when I try to run this script again, I run into an error. And this, for me, typically is a red flag because I like my code to be idempotent. So let's take a bit of a deeper look to see where the issue arises. And as you can see here from the output of the error, the first port where it arises is here, where I create the pandas data source. And luckily, if I take a look at that data source object and its methods, what we can see directly is that it gives an add or update method, which is nice because I can simply change this to add or update, and that should at least fix it for us for the data source part. So if I rerun this bit, then now we see that it actually runs, which is great. But if we then continue and run the rest of the script, we'll run into a similar error where it isn't able to add objects because they already exist. And to fix this error, we really need to take a look at where it happens and what we can do about it. So it happens here when we add the expectation suite to context suites. You see here that we use the add method. So a first step can be to check out which methods this object has, and there we see add, all, delete, and get. So sadly, there's no update method here. The nice thing, however, is that Great Expectations seems to be following the factory design principle, which we can see for the first time if we check out the type of the context suites object. And here we can see that it is a factory object. And now before we dive into a fix for this specific issue where we want to add an expectation suite, if we browse through the rest of the script, what we see is that we run into this problem multiple times whenever we want to add or basically add or update a Great Expectations artifact. So here for the validation definition, we see that we have a similar syntax where if I run it, I run into an error. And if I check out the type of the object that we are trying to add the validation definition to, it's again a factory object. And then if I check which method it has, we see that it's the same set of methods: add, all, delete, and get. And that's great because they use the same pattern, so we can create a function that leverages that pattern to do exactly what we want, which is basically updating a combination of delete and add. So I created a helper function for that, which you can see here, add or update GX artifact, which does exactly that. So it looks up the artifacts that are already present. It scans if the artifact that we're trying to create right now is already in there. And if that's the case, it will delete it and it will then add it back. So with that being said, let's take that specific function. And then we make sure to import it. So from helpers gx import, thank you very much, GitHub Copilot. And then we use this to replace the add or update calls in our code. And there we go. We've replaced the old methods with the new function that takes care of the add or update. And now if we run this code, then hopefully it runs. There we go. And now the nice thing is that I can run this code once, twice, 100, 1,000 times. As long as the code base stays the same, the output is going to be exactly the same, which is very nice if you want to run it in a CI/CD pipeline or whatever. So with that out of the way, one of the other things that I find in this script is that as it stands, I'm defining my constants in the script itself, which happens here, but also in the run script. So that's something that we can take a look at. And also it's not very dry, especially in the section where we define the expectations. What you constantly see is that we define the expectation, we pass it parameters, and then we add it to our suite. And we do this over and over again. So it would be very nice to create something to make that more efficient and make our code more dry. And given that it's just a lot of data that we want to bundle up, basically, what's nice to use here is a data class. So what I've done is I've created a GX validation config data class, which basically contains all of these constants in the first place. So data sources, asset definitions, and what have you. And then I also have a attribute in which I can store the expectations. And then with that, I can start moving my constants and my expectations into set object. And that's what you see here in this tutorial script, where I define my list of columns, I set the constants, and I set the expectations that I want to run. And as you can see here, I've chosen for a specific format for this nested dictionary, where at the key level, I'm using the actual expectations as objects. And then within it, there is a dictionary with 2 keys, 1 columns and 2 keyword arguments. And I've chosen that because, again, there's a pattern to expectations. So if we move back to the script as is, what you can see is that we have table level expectations, and those can differ in the keyword arguments that they get. But if you look at the column level expectations, what you often see is that there's the column keyword, in which you pass the column on for which column you want to run the expectation over, and then additional arguments. And especially since oftentimes you have column level expectations that you want to run over multiple columns, as we can see here for the date columns, but also for the null, we're basically running those over all our columns. That's something that we want to take into account for our config design. So given that setup, I've created 2 more functions to support in this regard. So the first one is validate suite dictionary, and this is just one that you can call in the setup script to check if the config with all of its values is defined as we are expecting it. And then the second one is the populate expectation suite. And this is the bit where that design of the expectation dictionary comes in, because as you can see in the function here, what we do is we check if the columns keyword is in the dictionary, and if it is populated, and if so, we start looping over the columns in that list and we apply that expectation. But if not, then what you see is that we're just taking the keyword arguments, from the dictionary, and we use that to run the expectation. So now that we have these functions and the new data class, we can go back to our scripts and start refactoring so that it uses these objects. So after the refactor, our script now looks like this, where you can see that the constants no longer sit in the script and also not in the run script, because we pull all of those from the data class that we've created. And also we've been able to abstract away a lot of the logic of the expectation suite, and we brought it down to this bit so that in the top level script, it's just a couple of lines and the actual complexity sits in the function and also in the data class. Now I hear you thinking, Jorik, why are you going to such lengths to refactor this logic and bring in this data class and bring in these functions? Nice looking code, but what's the win? Well, basically that in and of itself is the win, of course, because it takes away complexity. So the script itself is easier to read, so it's also easier to maintain. But the other nice thing is that now the setup and the run scripts are fully flexible, and I can add additional expectation suites just by adding more of these instantiated data classes. So here I created one for the tutorial, the GX tutorial config. But basically, if I would copy this one and populate it with other values and with other expectations for a different data set that I want to test, then what I can do is I can basically just use this setup logic, import that same config, and then run all of the logic, not just over the tutorial config, but also over another one. So overall, this is basically just setting me up for flexibility that I might need in the future. So with that out of the way, let's just check that everything runs. And if I run this script, then it does. And similarly for the run script that takes the other data set and then runs the checkpoint over it. Let's just see if it properly runs, and then there we go. And then as a final bit, I want to go and check the Datadogs website. Oh, that's the wrong directory. And there we go. Our Datadogs website. Well, obviously it's become a bit of a mess because I've been going back and forth between the two scripts, but as you can see, everything is now there and the whole setup as a whole properly functions. And if we dive into the contents of these runs, what we'll see is that our data has been successfully validated and that no issues were found. And that wraps up today's video. I hope you liked further exploring Great Expectations and gained a deeper understanding of its inner workings. Now I'd love to hear from you. Does this setup resemble your approach to data testing? Do you use GX or something else entirely? Let me know in the comments. If you like this type of content, then don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you next time.